You're making a mistake because Keenan didn't resist. It wasn't how he was trained. As he mumbled, equally, Marbury pulled Quicken's arms back and snapped the handcuffs shut. Too tight got you caught this time, huh? What were you caught doing? A woman in a sundress was frozen by her minivan, her eyes wide, before Keenan had even entered the store. An elderly couple whispered to each other close to the cart, return as a teenage lad pulled out his phone, and while everyone saw, nobody intervened. You fit the description, Keenan said in a low voice, and I ignored him. I had my ID in my back pocket. He yelled and pulled Keenan in the direction of their cruiser. What was that? You haven't even checked, Keenan asked. Coulson laughed cruelly and briefly. Marbury laughed as if it were a private joke, so you don't need to. Without saying another word, they tossed him into the back seat, and the door slammed shut as a last insult. Keenan's heart pounded, but not out of fear, as he sat there looking straight ahead. When you realized that no matter how much you had given, it was the deep sluggish anger that came. Regardless of how much you had demonstrated elsewhere, in their eyes, you were nothing at this time. After a long period of inactivity, a call finally crackled over the radio. The wrong guy suspect has already been caught throughout the town without a sweatshirt or gym shorts. There was no resemblance at all. Coulson cursed silently as Marbury's cheeks flushed. They ripped open the door and uncuffed Keenan in the parking lot without saying a word, and without apologizing. Without providing an explanation, Coulson yelled as if Keenan were a stray dog. They were sick of kicking around, so Keenan rose and steadily rubbed his wrists while maintaining eye contact. He said simply, "You'll hear from me," without flinching. Coulson snorted, and Marbury turned away. People were still staring at Keenan and murmuring, as he turned and headed back toward the hardware store door. While others pretended not to notice anything, he steadily picked up a cart and rolled it in the direction of the garden part, and began crossing items off his list, including gloves, hoses, nozzles, and soil. On the outside everything was as usual, but on the inside, something had changed. And he was aware that silence would not be the next step. Keenan completed his shopping, but it felt robotic. His body moved to grab things, steer the cart, and nod courteously in response to the cashier. However, his thoughts went in a completely opposite direction, the kind that makes your jaw tighten without you even noticing it. Every time he flexed his hands, the sting in his wrists flared as he loaded the soil bags into his trunk. Those handcuffs had been applied maliciously, not by accident. He took a quick look across the parking lot. The officers were no longer there, but the memory of it lingered there unsightly and heavy. When he heard a voice, he turned to see the retired Army vet who owned the pawn shop, Mr. Dalton. Gray crew-cut faded jeans 2 doors down usually had a slight coffee and sawdust odor. "You okay, son?" Dalton inquired, his face displaying worry. Keenan managed a tiny smile. "Yeah, Mr. Dalton." Dalton scowled, but from where I was standing, it didn't appear like there was any misunderstanding. Keenan shrugged as if it didn't matter, refusing to respond because he wasn't yet ready for a talk. Keenan nodded slightly. "I won't let those boys walk all over you," and Dalton narrowed his eyes. After giving him a solid pat on the shoulder, Dalton returned to his business. It was a brief exchange. However, it stuck, and he drove home without any music or news. Just the sound of tires on asphalt, and the nagging feeling that something needed to be done, not with yelling or fists, but with something they couldn't overlook. Keenan parked the truck in his driveway, and sat there for a while with the keys still in the ignition. His area was peaceful, with small 2-story homes along the street and children's bikes, left in driveways. Sprinklers running on the front lawns are normally safe. or at the very least, his mother should have been inside, he said, taking off his sneakers beside the entrance. You baby, yeah ma, as Francine Rucker yelled from the kitchen. She peeked her head around the corner and used a towel to wipe her hands. This time he grinned genuinely, albeit he was exhausted. Mothers know things without having to ask, so she watched him for a beat longer than was required. She inquired gently, "Are you sure you're okay?" He hesitated, then nodded, saying he was simply exhausted. She didn't press, simply looked at him and said she was there, if he needed to talk after supper, after the dishes were cleaned. Keenan found himself standing in front of the hall closet once the house had gotten used to its nighttime routine, the one where he held on to his army dress suit and the things that still seemed too close. With firm hands he reached for the uniform, his polished boots and medals neatly fastened on a velvet board. He thought that tomorrow would be different, so he meticulously arranged everything out on his bed. The battle jacket, leggings, white gloves and ribbons in perfect rows. The light from his bedside lamp struck the infantryman's emblem, shining like a reminder. You worked hard to obtain your position, and this wasn't about retaliation or creating a scene. It was to ensure they would never forget him, and to show them who he truly was. He sat glumly in the windowsill chair, and watched the street lights turn on one by one. His image gazed back at him from the squared shoulders and dark glass eyes. Keenan wasn't the type of man to act out of anger. He had faced more difficult situations than this, and emerged stronger. In theory, he supported order, but you couldn't ask for respect. You asked for it without ever raising your voice, and he reclined back, allowing the chair. He closed his eyes and creaked under his weight, knowing that they would see him tomorrow. Not by mistrust or ignorance, but by the indisputable truth, and their error would not be concealed by any badge or bravado. But for it to occur, the morning arrived with a thick layer of gray, and he had to be prepared for all eyes to be on him. Keenan was already awake when the first glimmer of light appeared through the curtains across the sky. He hadn't slept well, not because he was angry, but because his mind had been preoccupied. As he buttoned his dress, he drew the schedule of events that needed to occur by 6:30. Blues. Each piece of cloth felt familiar and rigid beneath his fingertips, like armor. The tailored jacket, the pressed pants, and the brass gleaming against the deep navy fabric, his combat infantryman emblem, was placed directly over his little plain ribbons. Laden with significance, he straightened his tie in the hallway mirror until it sat precisely. Then he put on his boots, which were so spotless, they nearly resembled glass. Downstairs, Francine watched him with silent pride, and something else while standing at the coffee maker. She handed him a travel cup and asked, "Are you sure about this?" Francine's mouth pinched as Keenan accepted it and nodded once they realized that was the only way they would listen. But instead of arguing, she just placed her palm over the medals on his chest. "You enter like the man you are, and I'll let them see it." He shuts the door after him. The lock clicked more sharply than usual, signaling that this was more than just another excursion into town. The trip to the sheriff's office was brief because Bismarck wasn't a big city. As he pulled onto Avenue C, the squat was just large enough to give the impression that you could vanish inside it if you weren't careful. The flag outside waved in the cool morning air as the brick building came into view. Keenan parked 2 spots away from the entrance and briefly turned off the engine. Breathing steadily and slowly, the weight of the uniform felt wonderful, and some people were milling outside. At first, 2 women hardly looked at the man with the clipboard as they unlocked bikes from a rack. It was simply another day, but something changed when Keenan opened the truck door and got out. Heads turned and eyes followed as discussions stalled to a halt. Without hurrying, he straightened his shoulders, adjusted his gloves, and approached the entrance. Inside the lobby, every stride was purposeful, and every breath was measured. A young deputy behind the counter looked up and paused, as the area buzzed gently with phones ringing in hushed whispers. The deputy's eyes widened, and his voice became rigid. "Can I help you, sir?" he inquired. "I'm here to make an official complaint," Keenan said, taking off his hat and tucking it under his arm. Even the deputy swallowed hard at the words. "Chief Bowden's inside. I'll inform him." Keenan gave a single nod and moved to the side, standing erect in the center of the foyer. A woman collecting a traffic ticket was among the bystanders who began to slink in behind him within minutes. When they saw a man inquiring about a building permit, they all stopped. One woman took out her phone and pretended to scroll, but it was obviously recording, while others muttered. 5 minutes later, the chief emerged, a wiry man with receding hair and weary eyes. After glancing at Keenan's outfit, he became pale. "Good morning," Keenan said calmly. Chief Bowden responded in the morning, his voice shaking a little. "Let's enter my office." Keenan claimed that he quickly took a folded piece of paper out of his inner jacket pocket. "I'm formally reporting the assault of Officer Brent Marbury and Deputy Wade Colson. Civil rights violation, wrongful arrest." The chief's hand trembled as he grabbed the paper. He whispered that he understood, and Keenan kept letting his words fill the room. "I anticipate a thorough investigation that is open to the public." The chief nodded rapidly, nearly bowing. People continued to watch as the deputy at the desk stared at red creeping up his neck. Keenan stood there like a monument to all wrongdoings, while capturing whispers. He put his hat back on his head after they attempted to delete it, and left without asking permission, only to be struck in the face by the bright sun outside. Despite the fact that the day had just begun and the town was already bustling, Keenan didn't flinch. Realized that this was only the first dam breach, and that the torrent would unstop once the truth began to surface. After Keenan left about midday, the sheriff's department's phones continued to ring. What began as whispers in the lobby evolved into heated discussions on Main Street. Word traveled more quickly than the chief could control it at barbershops and gas stations. People stooped over their coffee cups and whispered his name at Darley. As you can see from his attire, he appeared to be a damn general. It was about time someone confronted them. Keenan went home and waited in the interim. He didn't need to yell or chase reporters. By late afternoon, the truth was flowing on its own like a steady, unstoppable flood. Following Rain One station from Fargo sent a correspondent, local news vans began to appear all over town, like mushrooms. When covering the story of Young, Sharp and Hungry, Jessica Mullins goes directly to Bismarck. Jessica didn't let a good lead pass her by, so Keenan respectfully but firmly returned her call. "I'll make my statement once the department formally responds, not before the reporter gives their consent," and her voice tone conveyed that she held him in higher regard. Within the station, Chief Bowden, Deputy Colson paced back and forth like a caged beast, while sitting in his office with his head in his hands. Officer Marbury gazed at the floor, looking as pale as a sheet. "They're turning this into a circus act. I'm not even hurt," Colson snarled as he slammed a fist into his palm. Chief Bowden snapped his head up and said, "You laid hands on a man without checking ID. You cuffed, in a feeble manner. You want to complain that a decorated Army veteran isn't wounded in front of half the town." A knock at the door was answered by neither man. It was the mayor's aide, who was red-faced and perspiring. The mayor said to Bowden, "I want to see you right now." The chief muttered a curse but remained standing. He was aware of the demands, pressure, and inquiries that were coming because of the way the assistant kept moving from foot to foot. It was clear that the mayor was searching for heads to roll rather than justifications. A crowd was starting to gather in the parking lot, and some of them were holding placards that were quickly written on cardboard. Justice for Keenan, we support our veterans, and their honor is well deserved. Not all of the people were black, including teens wearing baseball caps and elderly ranchers, mothers carrying toddlers on their hips. The town had witnessed injustice firsthand, and for once they weren't acting as though they hadn't met Mr. Landers, the former principal of Keenan's high school. Keenan Rucker was one of the best young men I have ever taught, and he even showed up and spoke with a reporter. Land spoke in a tearful voice about what had occurred to him yesterday, saying it was a disgrace to the town. Every word struck Coulson, and Marbury sat in a tiny back room like a hammer. Every chant and angry voice outside struck them more forcefully than any court summons could. As they listened through the thin walls, at last, Marbury murmured, his voice scarcely audible above a whisper, "You think they're going to fire you?" Knowing that they were finished, and that there was no badge, Coulson chose not to respond, large enough to protect them from it. Keenan remained at home, and sat with his mother at the kitchen table, consuming a dish of baked chicken and green beans, as if it were any other Sunday. Francine inquired, with a gentle smile. Francine leaned over, and squeezed his hand as Keenan shrugged and completed the task at hand. What counts is that you handled it with dignity. Through the window, they could see the news van's lights. Keenan didn't look too long, as he blinked down the street like faraway stars. He didn't require attention because the crucial portion had already occurred. He got to his feet and forced them to look him in the eye, but the real test was still to come tomorrow. Would the system correct itself, or would it simply cover up the shame and act as if nothing had occurred? The small town of Bismarck felt a little smaller by Monday morning, as the story was picked up by modest national publications, first regional affiliates, followed by more well-known brands like Even a Piece on a Morning Talk Show, and Channel 7 News. The image of Keenan, towering, and in uniform, flickered on 1 million television screens. The hardware store was no longer important to anyone. The true narrative was about two officers who were simpler. People were incensed after an Army veteran was insulted on American soil. Overnight, the demonstration outside the sheriff's office grew in size. People brought coolers, lawn chairs, and poster boards. Some carried American flags to honor a local priest named Reverend Cyrus, not as a weapon. Dalton used a megaphone to address the throng in a clear, composed voice rather than yelling. He claimed that when one of our own is treated poorly, we are all treated poorly. Keenan stayed at home, because he didn't want to feed the media circus. He wasn't hiding. His phone rang and he received calls from strangers from neighboring towns, former teachers, and old Army friends. He carried a note with him that said, "Thank you, you reminded us what quiet strength looks like." Meanwhile, the walls were closing in the sheriff's office, leaving Chief Bowden with no other option. He put Officer Brent Marbury and Deputy Wade Coulson on administrative leave. The news was read sternly at a hurriedly scheduled meeting while an external probe was underway. "We take these accusations seriously, even though the chief appeared to push them where." He stated that a representative from the state's Office of Professionals was behind him, recording every anxious look. Reporters hurled questions like quick balls. Standards stood like a shadow with their arms folded. Why weren't assistants screened? Will the officers be charged with crimes? How can the public trust this department in light of what transpired? Bowden's responses were ambiguous and disappointing. A woman in the rear yelled, "If he had been in uniform, would you have cuffed him?" The audience went silent, and Bowden didn't respond because he didn't have to. Kids went up on their dad's shoulders to view the signs bouncing in the air as the mob outside yelled louder. At home, Keenan sat with Francie while older couples leaned on each other and shook their heads in disapproval. "You could certainly run for mayor after this," she remarked, while enjoying sweet tea on the porch. "It's not my thing," Keenan said, letting out a brief but genuine laugh that he hadn't felt in a long time. Francine said automobiles honked as they passed, and people waved. "I don't want to be anyone's hero." "You already are." The amount of pies, casseroles, and thank you messages the neighbors handed off was overwhelming, but Keith, with the same calm dignity that had seen him through that terrible time, he accepted it all. Later that evening, he sat by himself in the living room and browsed the local news channels outside the hardware store. The video repeatedly showed him standing in the sheriff's office foyer, but he didn't appear angry. Instead, he was still, like a man who didn't have to yell to be heard while on-air debates were taking place. A speaker stated that this is about a pattern and respect, not just about one man. Additionally, when someone like Staff Sergeant Rucker is treated in this manner, it serves as a reminder to all veterans and citizens whose ignorance can quickly obliterate their service. The discussion was not limited to Keenan. People were asking difficult questions and refused to be defeated because it was never about the wider picture. However, Keenan was aware that the true difficulty was that attention may be a double-edged sword, would be ensuring that this didn't simply disappear after the cameras were taken down. The inquiry proceeded more quickly than anyone had anticipated. 3 days after the public outcry peaked, Officer Brent Marbury and Deputy Wade Colson were placed on official leave without pay while they awaited termination hearings. The town veterans' pressure wasn't the only factor. Letters and phone calls from organizations throughout North Dakota deluged City Hall. A group of retired Marines even drove up from Minna to demand real accountability through emails and requests. Maintaining a 24-hour silent vigil outside the station while the Unum saw everything from a distance. Keenan saw everything from a distance because he knew, not because he didn't care. He consented to sit down with Jessica Mullins because he knew that the spotlight could deceive a man if he wasn't careful. From Channel 7 for a single unglamorous and undramatic interview, only his words and the truth were used in the interview, which was conducted at Memorial Park. Keenan was dressed in pants and a basic black t-shirt beneath the oak trees beside the Veterans Monument. Jessica cautiously asked the first inquiry, "No uniform this time." "He didn't." "What was going through your head when they took you?" Keenan stopped and gazed out over the green lawn. Finally, he said, "I wasn't thinking about myself, but more about how individuals these days don't have the opportunity to demonstrate who they are." Jessica gently nodded in reference to everyone who never receives the benefit of the due doubt. "What do you want people to learn from this?" "Voice steady regard isn't something you hand," Keenan said, staring straight into the camera. He claimed that it's something you owe to everyone you encounter, and that you should only do it when it's convenient, regardless of how they appear, where they're from, or what you believe you know about them. That night's program included only Keenan's straightforward and powerful words, without any dramatic music or flashing graphics, and people paid attention. A few days later, at a town hall meeting, the mayor formally apologized. He promised reforms inside the sheriff's department, and referred to Keenan as a pillar of strength. included community monitoring panels, and required bias training, but it wasn't flawless and wouldn't resolve every issue. However, it began at the same gathering, when Francine Rucker took the stage during the Kina session. She stated in a clear voice that my son didn't need a throng behind him, and that he didn't ask for any of this. He only required the same fundamental respect as everyone else. He didn't need a camera in his face. Deserves. The crowd fell still, and Keenan, seated 3 rows back, briefly bent his head. He simply let the weight of it to settle the way you do when you know something is real, without crying or smiling. Later that week, Mr. Dalton from the pawn shop met up with him outside after he had said it aloud. Dalton said, "You did good, son," and held out his hand at Grady's Hardware, where the fire disaster had begun. Keenan gave it a vigorous shake, but there was still a long way to go. Dalton nodded. Perhaps. Keenan watched as Dalton crossed the parking lot. "But you moved the line that matters." Tiny moves, whistling beneath his breath, and nods as he passes by. Change happened gradually, one glance at one handshake at a time. As he got into his pickup, a conversation began where there had been only silence. Keenan reflected on the hand that had shoved him against a wall, and all that had transpired. Regarding the faces that had turned away, and the voices that at last raised their voices in respect. It should have existed from the beginning, and wasn't awarded, because of medals or uniforms. You occasionally had to remain composed and steady when things weren't going up, and make the world see you for who you truly are. But Keenan understood that his journey was more than a simple battle. The goal was to ensure that no one ever had to face the same struggle by themselves. As usual, the noise subsided after a few days and then a week. Even as the numbers dwindled, the cameras packed up and the press vans departed, going back to the pace of small-town life. Yet Bismarck remained unique. It went beyond simply revising the department's regulations and implementing mandatory trainings. At the grocery store, more people made eye contact, and it was calmer than that. His name was taught to children in school, and strangers nodded a little more slowly and purposefully. Not because he had committed a violent act, but rather because he maintained his position with silent power. Keenan saw an elderly woman he had never met at the post office while passing. Without a word, the gas station clerk, who had never looked up from his register, pressed a thank you card into his hand. Every time he entered, he said, "Good morning, Sergeant Rucker." The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had moved, just enough to sense it one night when the sky turned the color of burnt gold, and the sun sank low. Once more, Keenan stood in Memorial Park, without a suit or uniform. He observed a bunch of children wearing only jeans, boots, and a simple gray hoodie. Their worries were as light as feathers, as they laughed and ran over the grass after each other. As he closed his church across the street, Reverend Dalton waved to Keenan, before vanishing inside. Few minutes later, Francie joined him. She handed him a cup of coffee and said, "You might want one." They sat on the bench for a long time, and he grinned, the lines around his eyes getting deeper. "Thanks, Mom." Saying nothing and simply seeing the town's breathing makes you regret anything. Francie drank her coffee as she inquired, and Keenan shook his head in response. "You stood out for all of us people who never had the opportunity, or the words to do so, not just for yourself." Keenan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let her words to sink in. Ultimately, he said, "You can't change people's hearts overnight, but you can show them what respect looks like." Francine smiled. "And sometimes that's enough to start something greater. You may hold up a mirror and force them to look at themselves." Keenan gazed as the sky turned darker blue, and the first stars appeared. Considering the men who had placed those handcuffs on him, he considered how simple it would have been to snap, to combine anger and hatred, but he hadn't, since dignity wasn't something you simply demanded. Even when no one else noticed it, it was something you carried within yourself, and that's what changed everything. Keenan stood stretching his back as they finished their coffee. There would be more work to be done, and more lessons to teach tomorrow. Before returning to the truck, live the truth at every turn rather than yelling. He looked toward the deserted park, the fading town, and the vast sky. He muttered, "Start here," and placed a hand on his chest, just above the spot where all the years had passed. All of his teachings and the fights he had waged, both visible and invisible, were still alive. There will always be times in life when you must decide whether to respond with strength or anger. Respect is demanded by the way you carry yourself, not just gained. If this tale struck a chord with you, even when no one is looking, pause to consider the kind of world by speaking, acting, remaining silent, and demonstrating your belief in defending dignity. You are contributing to the development of it. Subscribe button, and share this story, even if it's difficult. Together, let's make a difference. 2213, playing now. Which nation offers the world's best education? BBC World Service's The Global Story podcast. World Service on BBC 4 months ago. 1.4 million views. 308 VP. 100 times. Remix 2619. Playing now. Reginald Lewis. Entrepreneur. The transaction that changed history. 10 views of 557 K 2 months ago. 99 VP. 44 times. Remix 2154. Playing now. An explanation of Xi Jinping's ascension. Vox 10 million views a year ago. 2.4 KVPH 8. Remix 1629. Playing now. Can Trump defeat China in a trade war? BBC World Service's The Global Story podcast. World Service on the BBC. 2 months ago. 1 million views. 251 VPH 80 times. Remix 2055. Playing now. How will working from home develop in the future? BBC World Services, The Global Story podcast. World Service on the BBC. Views of 846K. 2 months ago. 256 VPH, 62X. Remix 2005. Playing now. Our Fighting Oligarchy tour is getting noticed by Republicans. Excellent. Sanders. Bernie. Views of 563K 2 weeks ago. 156 VP. 30 times. Remix 8. Playing now. The benefits of speaking various languages. What in the World podcast. BBC World Service. World Service on the BBC. Playing the BBC 204. K views 1 month ago. 72 VPH 50. Playing now. Maybe on track to be a 21st century Herbert Hoover's. Nicole Wallace on risks of Trump's trade war. MSNBC 576K views. 6 days ago. 204. 2 VPH. Remix new 2734. Playing now. India is not sitting on the fence, says External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. The print 3.8 M views. 2 years ago. 49 VP. 100 times. Remix 1833. Playing now. How Gen Z and TikTok are transforming the way we talk. The Global Story podcast. BBC World Service. World Service on the BBC. 1M views. 5 months ago. 274. VPH 80 times. Remix 2920. Playing now. Why are some individuals lousy at maths? Crowd Science podcast. BBC World Service. World Service on the BBC. 549. K views.
7 months ago, 37, VPH, 41 times, remix 27, 0, 6, playing now, Trump and tariffs, John Oliver, HB, last week tonight, 8.5 million views, 2 weeks ago, 14.1, KVP, 77X, remix is reality TV, a good age model for traders. The BBC, World Services What in the World podcast, World Service on the BBC views of 7.6K, 2 months ago, 2 VPH, 0.6X remix. The BBC Africa Eye documentary, Blood Parliament, BBC News Africa 3.2 M views. One day, 81.7, KVP, 100 times. Remix new all-out war with India could result from the Kashmir dispute. Pakistan warns. Sky News, 3.3 million views, 4 days ago. 4.5, KVPH, remix new. Why does Japan have millions of unoccupied homes? BBC World Services, the Global Story podcast. World Service on the BBC, 10.1 million views. 5 months ago, 168, VPH, 8, remix. China disputes the White House over tariffs, saying, reality bites Donald Trump, in the you-know-where. MSNBC, 4 days ago, 2 million views. 2K VPH, remix fresh. Do women make superior leaders to men? The BBC World Services, What in the World podcast, World Service on the BBC, 155. K views 40. VP, BBC, BP, John Oliver, HBO last week tonight, 6.6 million views, 10 months ago, 499. VPH, 59, X remix. Unaware that her twin daughters would grow up to be billionaires. She left them behind at birth. Afterward, this occurs. Judy's African folktales views of 67K, 4 days ago, 352, VP, 100 times, remix fresh.